My name is Mark Hauenstein. I currently work for AllofUs Design. AllofUs is a London-based interactive design agency, and currently I hold the position of Head of Research and Development here. So what that means is that I kind of look at new technologies that we might use in future projects, but also support client projects where we have to use technologies that we haven't used before. At the same time, I kind of get involved in the concept creation for certain projects, or I also do internal projects. I initially did a BA in Fine Art at Middlesex University, which was a broad-based fine art course, so I had a lot of freedom in terms of the media that I could use, so I already focused a lot onto media-related installations and computer-related or generative art. And after that I did a MA in interaction design at the Royal College of Art. One of the projects that I did at the RCA is called Audio Shaker.
Hello. 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 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4.
What I was really happy about it was a collaboration with Tom Jenkins, who essentially comes from a product design background, and I at that time came from an art background.
4, 2, 3, 1.
It was kind of a really nice sort of complementing duo that we were, and sort of we, on the one hand, had sort of the same interest in terms of what we wanted to achieve, but we had quite different skill sets. So Tom was very good in actually making a physical object, whereas I was good in sort of doing the electronics and doing the programming, for example. But basically, when it came to the conceptual side, that's, I think, where we were quite on one wavelength.
Capture, shake, hold. Hold, shake, shake, hold.
I think the main idea behind the Audio Shaker was to explore how you can interact with something as intangible as audio, basically. So what we did is basically take an analogy with fluids. And so we usually tend to use tools to handle fluids. We use containers like cups and flasks to basically pour fluids from one container to another. And so we wanted to apply that basically to sound. So give sound a certain mass, basically.
Capture, hold, shake.
Microsoft came to us basically based on that they have seen a presentation of one of our directors. And so they asked us to create something for conferences and events at Microsoft. In some sense, entertainment basically for the breaks between conference seminars. The other thing was that Microsoft is bringing out a new set of tools for designers. So essentially they wanted us to explore these new tools and showcase them, not in the sense of that we give a tutorial, but essentially sort of what can you do with these new expression tools. The project started off actually with exploring these tools, seeing what they're capable of, basically. So one of the interesting parts there was what we saw was pressure-sensitive stylus input. And there were sort of other software modules that would allow actually handwriting recognition, etc.
So the general concept was to create an interactive message board, essentially, where people can leave comments about the exhibition that they're at, things that they've seen, and kind of general thoughts. So the setup is that we have a large plasma wall which has a set of sensors running underneath it, and the sensors can detect how close you are to the wall. And as you approach the wall, these message bubbles, which contains thoughts, writing from people, pop out towards the user so they can explore the content.
We basically separated the user experience into two modes. So the one mode was supposed to be quite a social or communicative mode. So we really wanted people to write messages and then allow people to answer to other people's messages. So what we then proposed was a sort of system based on bubbles. So you would create one bubble, write your message in, and then following users would be able to click onto that bubble and then attach another bubble message towards it. Now these bubbles would all sort of appear in this kind of scrolling landscape. So the closer you would go, the bigger the bubbles would get, basically, and that's how you would be able to explore these messages. At the same time, we wanted sort of something that would have quite an impact from when you see the display wall from far away. Therefore, we did the second mode, which was much more gestural. It was drawing like with a magic wand. So you would be able to sort of do quite big gestures that would create these sort of magical trails within the landscape, which would sort of be more individual instances than social messages, I suppose. Generally, testing is really important. We had very little for this project. So generally speaking, I would say a month of testing is quite essential. I mean, testing can be, you have different types of testing. So you do user testing, does actually, do people understand how to use it? But then there's more things like robustness testing. So you leave an installation running for I don't know how many days without stopping, so you just make sure that the technology works. I think we had about a week or so, but we were still tweaking within the last week. I think that's another normal thing. So even if you have a solid system, then till the end you always sort of do minor modification. But there's sort of a cut-off time, basically, where you should say, well, no more features, basically, and that should be usually a month before something goes live. The first idea should be quite sketchy, I think, in terms of that you don't quite know whether an idea is yet feasible. So what you want to kind of prevent is that you give the client a concrete idea, and then you go through the whole process of scoping and developing afterwards, and in the end you can't deliver what you have initially proposed. So that's why you kind of have to make sure that the client understands that this is like a top-level concept. You have to really make the client believe in what you're proposing will actually be great and will happen actually. Once the client agrees, basically, then we go sort of into a scoping phase. So we look a little bit more into the feasibility of realizing the project. So that means obviously time, budgets, basically, but as well just can we actually do it, and what does it involve in terms of design assets creation? What does it involve in terms of programming? What does it involve in terms of fabricators that we have to get into the project? So it's kind of the whole planning stage, so that's what we call scoping. That kind of ends up in something we call a design specification. So that's sort of putting everything onto paper so the client knows, okay, this is what we're going to do, essentially. And once we get this agreed, then we kind of go into the build phase. It's hard to generalize the build phase, basically, because you have sort of people from very different areas working, on the one hand, in their own paths. So there's always time where you're kind of just doing your bit. So the graphic designers are just creating the assets, or the developers are just kind of building the software framework. But then there's always the point where these paths kind of cross, and that's quite important, basically, so that there's communication going on between the people from the different backgrounds. Essentially, we were approached by a cultural festival that is run every year for East London, and this year's topic was all around two modernist architectures composers. So one was Xenakis, a very well-known modernist composer, and the other one was Le Corbusier. We were asked to do something that was a little bit about the relationship between these two people. And so what we did then was to propose a public interactive sculpture that would, on the one hand, relate to the fields of interest of these two artists, but at the same time would bring in our kind of take on how to place digital art into the public space, basically. The concept was essentially to measure architectural space and take those measurements and turn them into a musical score. And technically speaking, what we did essentially was to create something similar to a radar. So we had a laser distance sensor that would spin around an axis and would measure the distance from one point to the surrounding architectural environment. The distances then would be plotted out as a graph, and that graph would then be turned into or translated into that musical score. There was a lot of research going on, so I mean I wouldn't necessarily consider them as direct collaborators, but basically I was probably spending 2 weeks just calling up companies who usually do sensors for industrial machines basically, and trying to figure out what kind of sensors I could use or what kind of mechanisms there are. But essentially, like by just calling up these companies and explaining your idea, you get a lot of information on how you could actually build it. So that is quite an important bit. In terms of the mechanics of the spinning top, that's something that our fabricator actually kind of figured out. So he's obviously got his contacts, and in the end, I think he used a ball bearing that is usually used for lorries, I think for the suspension or so. But on the build side, it was essentially me doing sort of the electronic side of it, and the programming side, for example. There was a screen element, so we had as well a graphic designer involved to kind of do the design assets and sort of the layout of that. We then have an external fabricator who we usually use for more sort of events-based or museum-related projects, and we basically asked him whether he can create us this spinnable concrete cylinder, and he said yes. And there was a lot of interaction going on with him basically, so it was really kind of us coming up with the shape and sort of how we imagine it to be, and sort of what we assumed basically in terms of what's possible, giving it to him, and he would come back with a sort of more realistic approach. One of us is also like a musician, so he could kind of took care of the sounds. Because it was in a public space, we had to kind of make sure that it wouldn't sound too disruptive. And then in the end, actually, with that project, we didn't have any testing or trial time at all. So once we installed the sensors in the object, then the next day we kind of put it into the public space. It wasn't quite as precise as precisely communicating the idea that we initially intended, but the really nice outcome was other things. That whole object became kind of like a subwoofer, so it created this really physical sound. So people kind of enjoyed the whole object in another way, that they could kind of spin the top around and it would have this kind of real physicality to it, and immediately there would be a sound feedback. So that became a much stronger part than actually sort of the conceptual or our conceptual thinking behind it, of like measuring the architectural space and turn it into music. I mean, personally, it's really important for me to work in this kind of trial and error mode, or to work quite iteratively. So I build one thing and then I build on top of that, basically. When you're in a company doing that, it has to be a little bit more grounded, obviously. So you kind of have to document what you're doing, and as well as sort of see how can it actually be of benefit to the company. So it's kind of trying to get the balance of just in between just getting excited about doing new things, basically, and then kind of seeing how can you fit it into real world projects again. Even if you work on a sort of boring project or so, I think it's quite important that you find your exciting bit in it. So if there's always something that you can do in a new way, or in a way that you haven't done before. So I think that's really important once you're working in the commercial world, basically, to find this excitement. Yeah, I think there are two sides to coming from an art background. I think what it allows you is really to sort of look into areas that are not necessarily your field of expertise, basically, and sort of taking inspiration from there and connecting ideas from other disciplines with whatever you're doing. So combining things that you wouldn't actually imagine to fit together. I think that's something you really do in art, basically. The downside of like coming from an art background initially is basically you're considered as a sort of jack of all trades, so you can do a little bit of everything, but you don't have a special skill necessarily. In that sense, it helped me a lot, for example, that I had a very sort of strong technical skill set, so I had a certain sort of specialization there. I think what's most important is sort of to learn how to communicate your ideas or your thinking. I think that's overall one of the most important things. You can do really great stuff, but if you can't inspire other people to believe in it, like it's not going to go anywhere, basically. So I think things like storytelling and storyboarding and literally just kind of being able to visualize an idea in what form, it doesn't really matter if you want to use video, or if you want to use sketching, or if you even want to use programming for that. That doesn't really matter, but sort of just finding one personal way of that you are really confident of communicating basically ideas. I think that's really important. That's something you always will need. I think the other thing is basically, I think if I look back, and I think that's where my fine art background was as well quite good, in the sense that I was sort of let loose, and you kind of do things quite independently. It's sort of the ability to learn by yourself. I mean, it's good to have people that teach you, but at the same time, you're not going to stop learning, basically, once you start in the commercial world, or at least for me, I think it's really important that you continuously kind of develop your skill set and develop your thinking. So what's really important there is that you know how to find the information relevant to your field, for example, or how you can actually make use of a tool and not be reliant on doing a training course, for example. I think that's quite helpful. Projects should be sort of something we haven't seen before on the one hand, but at the same time we kind of should be able to imagine it in the real world, I think. But I think what's really important is basically that it's kind of that you can imagine actually to work together with that person. So that's actually sort of not necessary to do with any kind of technical skills, or it's much more to do with interhuman relationships. I mean, you get a sense of it. So like, don't try to be someone you are not, basically. Just be quite natural, and sort of essentially that's a really important part, that you work together with people you think you're kind of on one wavelength, and people you think are nice, essentially.